Last night was a real moment of moral truth for Labour MPs. It's worth noting that the Welsh Senedd managed to vote a week before for a motion in favour of a ceasefire in Gaza, and Welsh Labour government ministers abstained, but backbenchers had a free vote. Holyrood's ceasefire vote is coming up next week, but last night the SNP put forward one of two amendments to the King's speech concerning the situation in Gaza. Labour put forward the other. The Labour amendment didn't call for a ceasefire, the SNP amendment did. The result? Both were voted down by the Tory majority. But it's the divisions in Labour that are grabbing headlines today. Ahead of the vote, Labour MPs were subjected to a 3-line party whip to support the Labour amendment and abstain from voting on the SNP amendment. Any MPs in Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet who went against this would lose their position. Some did it anyway. 56 Labour MPs out of a possible 193 voted for the SNP amendment, backing an immediate ceasefire, and 4 more say they would have voted for it if they had been able to make it down to Westminster for that vote. Those 4 MPs are Tony Lloyd, Kim Johnson, Mick Whitley, and Olivia Blake. Most importantly, 8 shadow ministers and 2 parliamentary aides publicly defied the whip to vote for the SNP amendment. I'm going to read out every single one of them to you right now. Jess Phillips, Shadow Home Office Minister. Naz Shah, Shadow Minister for Crime Reduction. Asfal Khan, Shadow Minister for Export. Yasmin Qureshi, Shadow Women and Equalities Minister. Paula Barker, Shadow Minister for Devolution. Rachel Hopkins, Shadow Minister for Veterans. Sarah Owen, Shadow Minister for Local Government and Faith. Andy Slaughter, Shadow Solicitor General. Mary Foy, Private Parliamentary Secretary to Angela Rayner, and Dan Cardin, Private Parliamentary Secretary. Most high profile of those resignations is, of course, Jess Phillips. Phillips also wrote a letter to explain her decision. Here's some of what she said in that letter. This week has been one of the toughest weeks in politics since I entered Parliament. I've tried to do everything I could to make it so that this was not the outcome, but it is with a heavy heart that I will be leaving my post in the Shadow Home Office team. On this occasion, I must vote with my constituents, my head, and my heart, which has felt as if it were breaking over the last 4 weeks with the horror of the situation in Israel and Palestine. I can see no route where the current military action does anything but put at risk the hope of peace and security for anyone in the region now and in the future. Ash, Jess Phillips is not associated with the left of the party. What does this say about the scale of yesterday's rebellion?
Well, I think this shows that Keir Starmer has a problem in terms of getting the entirety of his party behind his line, which is humanitarian pauses, but ultimately we're going to defer matters of foreign policy over to the US. Why did Jess Phillips rebel and voluntarily resign rather than abstain on a motion calling for a ceasefire? I think there are 2 things that you've got to bear in mind. The first is obviously Jess Phillips does have a large Muslim population in her constituency. There is a very straightforward electoral case that if you want to hold on to your seat, you don't want to piss off that community too much. And as we've seen in terms of the, huge numbers of British Muslims who are out on the protests every weekend. This is a matter which is very close to the Muslim community's heart. But I don't think that's the only thing that explains it. Rashanara Ali, who is a MP based around Bethnal Green, she has a very large Muslim population in her constituency, and yet she didn't vote in favour for a ceasefire. So large Muslim populations aren't the only thing that explain why an MP might want to rebel against the leadership line. I think that there is a genuine crisis of conscience. The Labour Party is still very much scarred by the war in Iraq. The loss of trust from many voters towards the party, a sense of very deep betrayal on the Labour benches. And Jess Phillips herself has said, look, I wasn't an MP during the vote to go to war in Iraq, but had I been, I would have rebelled against Tony Blair. So I don't think that this is something which is wildly new for her. I think that this is 2 things combining. One is there's an electoral case. You don't vote against the interests of having a large Muslim electorate in your constituency. But then the second thing, I think, is that this was a genuine matter of conscience for Jess Phillips, and that's why she resigned.
Some of Jess Phillips's fellow MPs also spoke passionately about their support for a ceasefire, except when it came down to it, some didn't actually support one. This is a video from MP for Batley and Spen, Kim Ledbetter, that she posted to social media ahead of the Commons vote.
I just wanted to send out a short message ahead of the vote in Parliament this evening, which sets out my position clearly. Of course, I want a ceasefire in Gaza. Which human being on this planet wouldn't? But what I won't be doing this evening is voting for the SNP amendment. And the reason I won't be doing that is because even if I did, nothing would change. There is no quick and simple solution to the crisis in Gaza. We have to set out a framework which leads towards that much needed ceasefire.
If the vote won't change anything, if it's completely meaningless, why was there a 3-line whip to vote against the SNP motion? And why don't you just vote for it anyway? How on earth does Labour's wishy-washy amendment set out any such framework towards that piece? But you know what, I'm going to give this to Kim Ledbetter. At least she announced ahead of time that she wouldn't be voting for the SNP motion. Some Labour MPs took a third, even more bizarre, even cowardly, you might say, route. Here's Helen Hayes, Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years, speaking passionately in favour of an immediate ceasefire during the debate before that vote.
We cannot look at the horror and suffering on our TV screens and conclude that the scale of destruction we are witnessing is proportionate or that the denial of aid into Gaza is within international law. And again, we must stand in solidarity with all those affected, the injured, the families who are bereaved, and those who are so desperately worried about their loved ones in Gaza. I have heard from thousands of my constituents who have been in contact with me over the past month to share their views. Yeah. They too are completely horrified at what they are seeing, and they want to see every possible effort being made to stop the conflict. They understand that this is what is being signalled by the word ceasefire. In calling for a ceasefire, no one is suggesting that the cessation should be unilateral or that it should be without conditions. Hamas must release the hostages. In war, ceasefires do not always hold, and I think we must all be realistic about the intensity of this conflict. But a bilateral humanitarian cessation of the violence, a ceasefire, is surely the minimum we should be demanding in the face of such horrific suffering. I fully understand that colleagues will have different views from their constituencies, and there is no easy response to this appalling conflict. We must all treat each other with respect at this time, but we must, all of us, be able to stand in front of our own constituents with integrity and at peace with our own conscience on the issues that matter most to them. And my conscience tells me that I must call for a ceasefire today.
So how did Helen Hayes' conscience make her vote on the SNP amendment that called for an immediate ceasefire that came after that heartfelt speech? Well, she abstained. Here's what Helen Hayes tweeted after the vote. Today, I made my position absolutely clear. I support a ceasefire in Gaza. I did not vote for a divisive amendment by the SNP, but I will continue to represent the views of my constituents on the issue and to call for a hashtag ceasefire now. I'm calling for a ceasefire now by not voting for a ceasefire now. Makes total sense. But then former Labour speechwriter Alex Nuns made an interesting claim. A reliable Labour source has told me certain MPs were given licence by the leadership to sound like they supported a ceasefire for social media clips and so on, provided they didn't actually vote for one. A scheme to deceive constituents on an issue of life and death. Classy. Now, this is a very bold claim, right? So Novara HQ did what we do. We actually did some reporting and we reached out to our sources. We've had it confirmed by a separate Labour PLP member that this claim is true and that Labour MPs are discussing it widely. And the names of 2 MPs have been mentioned explicitly in connection with such a deal, let's call it that. These are Helen Hayes and Florence Eshalomi, MP for Vauxhall. According to our source, their, quote, resignation letters were written, but their minds were changed last minute. Florence Eshalomi has also released a statement after the vote she abstained on, and this is what she wrote in her accompanying tweet. I've received many emails from constituents. I've made my position clear in that I support a humanitarian ceasefire. I did not vote for the divisive SNP amendment, and I will continue to represent the views of my constituents. Without getting too conspiratorial, both Eshalomi and Hayes use the exact same language in their message, and I'm sure there's some sort of document going around, but I made my position clear. I support a ceasefire. I did not vote for the divisive SNP amendment, and I will continue to represent the views of my constituents. Keir Starmer does not have a gun in my back. Meep morp. We've reached out to both Helen Hayes and Florence Eshalomi to ask for comment on this, but at the time of broadcast, they hadn't got back. However, someone who didn't even pretend to vote for a ceasefire or be conflicted about the decision was Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. Streeting released a 4-page letter on social media that he sent to constituents explaining his choice. It's a lot of words, so I'm just going to sum up his main point, which is he thinks a ceasefire is pointless to call for because Hamas will violate it, and he's also saying it's meaningless to publicly support a ceasefire as a British opposition politician because it needs to be negotiated by international diplomats. The same argument that Starmer uses in the same breath as him saying, okay, but I'm going to be in government really soon and I need to have a good relationship as well with the G7. Now, Streeting appeared on LBC earlier today to further double down on this argument.
Where I disagree with those who've, in terms of colleagues in Parliament on this question of ceasefire, is, okay, you voted for a ceasefire, you've told your constituents that you've done that, and the principle that you've stood on. How's that come about when you've got Hamas saying they would repeat the 7th of October again and again? You've got the Israelis saying, we're not going to allow Hamas to do that, we're going to take them out. So where's this ceasefire coming from? It's all very well in politics to, especially when you're under pressure and you've got the emails coming in and, and
to vote
people,
for what you wish would happen.
And people who are really distressed about the images, and who couldn't be. You've got to provide real solutions, and I'm afraid as politicians, you can't vote for something unless you've got a serious plan. And I think Keir Starmer understands that, and he understands that, yes, of course, there are people in our own country who are looking at him for leadership. Our allies and our adversaries around the world are also looking at him and questioning, well, what kind of Prime Minister would we be dealing with in Keir Starmer? And I think our G7 allies are looking at Keir Starmer and thinking, yeah, this is a guy who's committed to this partnership, who will work in lockstep with us for our collective defence and security. And even, partners in the Arab League, who maybe aren't quite in the same place as the UK government on this question of ceasefire and on the same place as where Keir is, but will respect the position and respect the consistency. So, what we're focused on is real solutions, both to the humanitarian disaster now, but also how we stop this endless cycle of violence and bring about a state of Palestine alongside a safe and secure state of Israel.
Never mind that one of the key leaders of the G7, Emmanuel Macron, has called for a ceasefire and has also said that he hopes the UK will follow suit, which they don't seem to be doing anytime soon. But do you know what? I have less disdain for Wes Streeting than I do for the likes of Helen Hayes. Sure, Streeting is using up an awful lot of words to try and intellectualise why he's a careerist who won't oppose a campaign that's killed 0.5 of the Gazan population in a month. But he outright doesn't back a ceasefire, and he's said that. However, Helen Hayes is expressing a moral position that she doesn't actually action when it comes down to it. She says she supports a ceasefire. She speaks passionately about the need for a ceasefire. But when push comes to shove, she won't actually back one.
I think that there is an offensive irony in Helen Hayes saying that it's a matter of integrity. I've got to vote with I've got to go with my conscience, and then to vote against her conscience. I mean, where's the integrity in that? And you're right to say that there is something deceptive, there is something underhand and utterly lacking in integrity to adopt all of the rhetoric and the social media signaling of backing a ceasefire, and then when presented with your one parliamentary means of forcing that to be the UK's line, you abstain. I mean, it's completely indefensible from a moral or a political perspective, because if you're going to abstain on the motion, you may as well just be Wes Streeting and saying, look, I'm not going to vote for a ceasefire. These are the reasons why, blah, 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 go Israel. That's at least got some level of honesty to it, even if I completely object to the foundation of and the content of his analysis of the situation. So it's I think that this is the worst of the Labour Party. It is a desire to appear compassionate and empathetic, a desire to recognize the suffering of others because that reflects on your own identity and your own politics. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, you're going to prioritize your own career over doing anything about those injustices.
I think there's another thing to this as well that I've been discussing recently, and I really want to get your take on it. This war between morality and strategy. Stay in Labour, stay on the front bench. It's more effective for change making versus, follow your conscience, resign, quit the party, etc. Where do you sit on this? And why are the two seemingly so opposed at the moment?
Well, because there is a tension between these two things. And I don't pretend to have a straightforward answer of always do this or never do that. I think it's different for different politicians. Ultimately, if you're a shadow minister for, some molecular role, I don't think it is that much of a big deal for you to resign. It's probably the more powerful thing to do in this instance to resign over calling for a ceasefire, because the actual power that you have is very little when it comes to the direction of policy, and the impact you can have with your resignation here is much, much bigger. I think that changes once you start getting to the shadow cabinet level. So once you start thinking about people who are shadowing those great offices of state or have as part of their remit something really huge. So the example I'm thinking of here is Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband, as we all know, has been across the climate brief, and there has been relentless negative briefing against him by Labour right-wingers who want to water down Keir Starmer's commitment to things like a Green New Deal, funding decarbonisation even further than it already has been watered down. Now, I'm not trying to say, well, climate versus Palestine, climate's obviously more important, but there is actually a strategic consideration here, which is, would you want the one person who's really pushing for big state spending over climate change to do exactly what the Labour right want and resign over calling for a ceasefire? That's a genuine strategic consideration. For me, the answer there is no. But like I said, that's different from people whose briefs are that bit smaller, and I think they can have greater impact with a resignation. So it's not about going, here's the hard and fast rule, and here's the thing that you always have to do. But it is about considering all the different factors. What's your brief? What are you doing with it? Whose interests are you standing up for within it? And what is this issue at hand? And this was part of the debate I had, not with a Labour Party member, but with former Conservative MP Rory Stewart, which is, what is the line you should break with the party leadership on? For him, it was voting against a Cameron-imposed 3-line whip to abolish the House of Lords. For me, I thought that it was quite revealing and telling that the straw that broke the camel's back was about a matter of constitution and how British political structures work, rather than something like austerity. And we disagreed about what the straw that broke the camel's back ought to be. So I think that there's a lot of variety. You're not going to have a huge amount of agreement between individual politicians on this. But I think that if you're, a shadow minister for something tiny, just fucking resign. That's going to be the most impactful thing you can do.